Welcome to the Jena Club of Cardiac Surgery Enthusiasts.
We are a group of young cardiac enthusiasts exploring the world of heart surgery from every angle.
From the lecture hall to the simulation lab
to the doctor's office, where we dive deep into patients' care.
We're here to share the realities, challenges and thrills of cardiac surgery.
We will talk about groundbreaking research and innovation in cardiac medicine. And yes, sometimes we will bring you the lighter side of surgery too.
Get ready for stories, insights and interviews from the heart of the city of science, Jena, Germany.
We are cardiac surgery enthusiasts and this is our podcast. Enjoy the episode.
Welcome to our second episode of Jena Club of Cardiac Surgeon Enthusiasts podcast. Today I have a new co-host, and that's my not only a colleague but a friend, Dr. Tullio Caldonazzo. Tullio, could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. I'm Tullio Caldonazzo. I'm a fellow in cardiothoracic surgery in the Department of Cardiothoracic Surgery in Jena University Hospital, quite in the middle of Germany. And as a particular thing, I just want to say I'm quite into in epidemiology and clinical trials. I'm dedicating a lot of my time, my extra time outside the OR to understand more about it and to be really connected in an academic perspective in the surgical field.
And today we have two really special guests. I'm really excited. Professor Kristin Sainani from Stanford and Professor Regina Nuzzo. She's working in Washington, D.C. So we'll start first with Kristin. Could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Tamar. Yes, I'm Kristin Sainani. I'm a professor at Stanford University. I'm in the Department of Epidemiology, but I primarily teach statistics and writing. I also do some freelance science writing on the side. I teach a lot of online courses, including a course about how scientists can write better on Coursera called Writing in the Sciences. And Regina and I just recently launched a podcast trying to teach people about good statistics and good practices in scientific papers. And it's called Normal Curves. And we'll be happy to talk more about that today.
Sure. Regina, what about you? Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Regina Nuzzo, and I'm a professor at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., where I teach statistics, and I actually teach statistics in sign language. So all my students at Gallaudet University are deaf, and we use sign language rather than spoken language to communicate. I'm also a freelance science writer like Kristin, and also with Kristin, co-host of this new podcast. Kristin and I also teach a number of courses, and we are both so passionate about good, clear communication.
So I'm one of your students as well in Coursera, and I'm one of your biggest fans from your podcast, Normal Curves. We'll talk about that a bit later, but first, Kristin, tell me about your pathway. How did you decide to do science and statistics?
Yeah, so I got interested in science, early on as a kid because of DNA and the whole story of how DNA works and how that was discovered. I found that fascinating. The other stories I used to like to read about when I was a kid was like how they eradicated smallpox and, epidemics. And so I think biology sort of piqued my interest, and I ended up studying biology in college. I went on to study epidemiology after that, but found that the part of epidemiology that I enjoyed was the numbers part. So that's how I ended up spending a lot of time in the statistics department at Stanford.
And Regina, what about you? I know your pathway is really inspiring. Tell us more about your pathway and how did you decide to do science and statistics and how you inspire a lot of people around the world.
Thank you. Yes, I was always a bit of a geek growing up, and I always loved science, but I loved math and numbers. And I think that is what convinced me that I wanted to do engineering. I studied industrial engineering for my undergraduate, and it had a lot of statistics in it, but it was applied statistics. We were applying it to manufacturing systems or inventory systems, or how FedEx managed to organize, all of its delivery systems, and I just loved that. I love statistics and math because it helps you make sense of the universe. That you get chaos and mess, and we never have complete information about the universe. It's always just so confusing. And you can take all that messy information and apply statistical tools, mathematical tools, and make sense of it. And it helps you make decisions and clarify it. And I think this relates with me and my deafness as well, because I get incomplete information about the world. I never hear everything. I can't rely on getting perfect communication, perfect information. And so this idea of a brain or a mathematical pattern recognition engine could make sense of all of that and help us just make the world a better place. I think that's what inspired me.
Okay, perfect. So I have a particular question from you too, which is this: is there a specific or a main topic that you do in your daily basis regarding statistics? Are you more into, survival analysis, meta-analysis? Is there a specific topic that I would say that's your favorite point?
I can go on
Kristin.
that. I sort of teach a broad range of statistics. So everything from probably my favorite, honestly, is the probability unit that I do. I love to teach probability. I'm not doing probability every day in my job. When I'm analyzing data, I'm mostly doing applied statistics where I'm analyzing data. But, my true passion is probability. But I do teach everything through, from basic statistics and probability to survival analysis, mixed models, logistic regression. So a lot of the topics that you would be using to analyze data for the scientific literature. And I do most of my applied statistics in the area of sports medicine, actually.
Okay. And how about you, Regina?
I would say I love all of statistics, especially applied statistics. For me, it's not about the matrix algebra. It's about solving problems and clever tools for doing that. One area I particularly love is data visualization. I love this idea, again, that you can take this information and you can summarize it in numbers or in words or in pictures. And when you combine the three of these things together, that synergy gives you a way more nuanced picture of what's happening than any of those one things alone. So I love a good data visualization in there.
Okay, sounds really good. I have also a second question. So we are doing our training in cardiothoracic field, and we are seeing that in the last years, there is a growing interest in how to expand the knowledge in epidemiology between the surgeons. And probably the main reasons why that's happening is because nowadays we have several kinds of interventions. For example, if a patient has aortic valve stenosis, he can underwent a traditional surgery, AVR, that's aortic valve replacement, or he can receive a transcatheter valve. So we have different therapies with different levels of invasiveness. So that's why nowadays people really need to understand the outcomes of these therapies in follow-up to recommend the best therapy. So we truly can see there is a different perspective inside the surgical community. People really want to understand epidemiology to be better physicians. Which are your thoughts in this topic?
Yeah, epidemiology and understanding the scientific literature and how we get evidence about, what's the best therapy for a given type of patient. I think it's super critical for surgeons and physicians to understand where that evidence comes from. What are the weaknesses in that evidence? What are the strengths? How do you read papers? That's kind of a little bit of what we're trying to teach actually on our podcast, Normal Course, is how do you read papers and weed out the good methods from the bad methods. And so it's super important for physicians and surgeons to know how to look at that evidence and evaluate the strength of the evidence. And that's a lot of what epidemiology teaches. So certainly important for physicians to have that training.
Especially to be able to understand the strengths and weaknesses of particular types of study designs. So if we're talking about observational studies, then I, as a critical consumer of the literature, I'm going to be looking for different things, asking different kinds of questions, and poking that evidence in different ways. I'm going to be looking at the effect size in there. I'm going to be asking about confounders and what kind of information they measured along the way. If they're doing clinical trials, then that's a different kind of evidence entirely. I'm going to be asking different questions of that. So although clinical trials can be the gold standard, they have to be done well if they are going to be that useful. Or are we talking about meta-analyses? How do we read meta-analyses and get important information from that? So understanding the different study designs in there, I think, is the key to starting, realizing that not all research is equal.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think that's really good that you raised this point about the different designs or different nature from studies, because you probably know we have an ongoing debate about how important is when evidence produced from observational studies, and probably randomized clinical trials should be the gold standard. But we have limitations to do randomized clinical trials inside the surgical field. We know we probably cannot have a perfect control. We cannot do shunt surgery for obvious ethical reasons. Which are your thoughts about that? Because if you take a look at the history of heart surgery was born with case reports, then we had case series, then the surgeons started to have long-term follow-up and showed, okay, this technique have more mortality in the short term, but we have better long-term outcomes. And then we had a how can I say, slow progress to go to randomized clinical trials. But still nowadays, we cannot randomize patients to all conditions. Which are your thoughts? How can we produce solid evidence, but still in this field of observational studies?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's funny because you mentioned sham surgery. Regina and I are now taping an episode of Normal Curves, and we're talking about sham surgery. So it's such a fascinating topic, this idea that you would actually do surgery on somebody but go in and do nothing. But we're talking about it not in the context of heart disease, because I don't think it's ethical if you have heart disease to do sham surgery. So it's an interesting question because, we can't do a randomized trial for every possible intervention and for every possible condition. To the extent that we can do randomized trials, obviously those are the gold standard, and there's a value in doing those, which is why they even have some randomized trials where they do sham surgery. And but for observational designs, there's a lot of work in epidemiology right now to try to do causal inference. That's a whole discipline of causal inference, which is a whole set of methods where we're trying to do, not going to be as good as a randomized trial, but what's statistically or with study design clever ways we can get at causality without doing a randomized trial. Again, not as good as a randomized trial. I'll mention that Regina and I actually have a whole course on randomized clinical trials that we teach on Stanford online. So we do recommend that anybody who wants to make sure they're doing those correctly and best practices, that's a good course for that.
Causal inference is fascinating. I'll just say that. And the work that they're doing with bringing genetics in there, I don't know if that is part of your field as well, but to look at the interplay of all of these different factors and try to create this hypothetical world. What if this had been an intervention instead of allowing people to choose, or the doctors to choose whatever treatment? This is another example of math does amazing things in organizing the world.
Okay, great. I have one more comment, and then I can take over to Timur. One last question. So we commented that now we have a change of mindset inside the surgical community. And for me, it was pretty clear when I started my residency, and I I needed to write grant applications, or we are testing a new device. So you need to understand epidemiology. Otherwise, you cannot discuss with FDA regulations, things like that. I don't know if you have contact also with medical students. Can you see also this changing of mindset in the students, or you just see physicians when they are starting his professional career and then they decide to understand epidemiology and biostatistic because they need that, or can you already see that in the young one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little biased because most of the students I teach are med students and doctors. So by design, they've already figured out that they need to know epidemiology. So I might, I may be a little bit biased in my perspective because I'm already getting them coming to learn from me because they know that they need that training. So I don't know, Regina, what's your thoughts on that?
I think that some of the landscape has changed because now we have statistical software that makes it easy for every investigator to do their own data analysis. And in the past, we had statisticians. You would just hand over data and someone else would do the statistical analysis, and then you would get the results back, and then you were done. And now it's more do it yourself. So I do see researchers now realizing, often at a younger age, but quickly when they get to the point of needing to write grants, I should understand what's going on here so I can communicate in this language and interpret findings.
Great answer. So I will slightly switch the topics because, as you can see, Tullio is more into that stuff. He has experience and he has knowledge, but I'm a blank sheet. In that stuff, I make my first baby steps into clinical epidemiology, and I will allow our audience and you as well just to hear my own story. When I was student, my epidemiology teacher, shout out to Professor Vankov. Please don't be mad at me. I was never in epidemiology classes. It was always Fridays, I believe, and Fridays I had the opportunity to go to OR, and surgery was my passion. And I was telling my professor, please let me go to the OR. I have nothing to do with clinical epidemiology. And she told me, in few years, you will come to me, to my room, and you will ask me, how can I learn clinical epidemiology? Last year, that day came. So my question
what made you
is,
change? What made you change?
the you know that song, The Wind of Change from Scorpions? That song, Wind of Change. It came from my mentor now, and the chief of our department, Professor Dunst, because he opened my eyes for science. For me, surgery before that was only stitching, cut, stitch, and that's it. That was for me. He opened my eyes. He taught me how important it is to be scientific, developed, and to have that knowledge. So my question is, what are your top 3 tips for somebody like me? For somebody who is making his baby steps, his first steps in science and in epidemiology and statistics?
Well, first of all, I think it's good that surgeons are putting surgery first and getting their training, because certainly you want your surgeons to have tons of time in the OR and tons of practice. So I do see this with my students too, like their clinical duties come first. They're learning to do that. That's the priority. And I think it is a little bit later in your career that you recognize, hey, the literature is there. I've got to use that to become a better doctor or a better surgeon, because I'm going to be more informed. But I applaud the focus on clinical and doing surgery well first. But if you want to get into epidemiology and statistics. There are so many resources out there. There are, online courses. There are podcasts like Regina and I are doing. There
Yes.
are books, so I think there's just a lot of material. We're in a great day and age when there's just a lot you can find on the internet and great resources. So it's something you shouldn't be intimidated by. And that's one of the things I always like to tell students. I think statistics, especially, is very intimidating for students. And it's helpful for you to know that a lot of what I do, like when I criticize the literature, is like make sure that the addition is correct. Right? So you don't necessarily have to have a high level of training in statistics to be able to spot problems or to know when it's well done. Yeah. So just to have trust in your own math ability. Yeah.
That's great advice. I think that I might advise a different route that's complementary to what Kristin said, and that is going to popular science books. There are some that are written extremely well for a general audience, but in a way that doesn't talk down to you, doesn't dumb down the science or the statistics, and written by experts in their fields or expert science journalists who have done a lot of research on their own. I can think of books that have gone through in great detail, but in an entertaining way, about the science behind nutrition studies, or the science behind sports medicine studies, or there's a fabulous book out by a statistician, David Spiegelhalter, The Art of Statistics, that gives you all of this information in this really intuitive way, and that I think will help bolster that that internal gut confidence that Kristin is talking about, and that will empower you to go on and then read some of the drier, more technical literature.
Actually, if I could add one thing there, the other advice I would give is if you are new to the scientific literature, I think it's that when you first pick it up to read a paper on statistics, it's all very intimidating. And one of the things I like to tell students is if you don't understand that paper, it is not because you are not smart enough. It is because the literature is badly written. And so look for places where people have explained it well. It's not on you that you can't understand it. It's on that we write badly in science.
Good point.
So we are coming exactly at that point that I wanted to notice. And Kristin, how can I write good in science?
So my first piece of advice there is don't emulate the scientific literature. I think students automatically, of course, when you first are immersed in this, you are reading papers and you're saying, oh, I should write like that. Okay, so I got to use all the big words and tons of acronyms and as much jargon as possible and make it as long and complicated as possible. And that is the worst way to write. And unfortunately, because that's how the scientific literature, most papers are, students look at that and they think, oh, I have to do that in order to be published. So a lot of my course, as you know, at Coursera is trying to tell people, no, don't emulate what's in the literature. And actually, the way to write is just the opposite of that, which is you want to get your idea across as clearly and quickly as possible with the least complication and the least jargon. And we're just not used to thinking about that as scientists because we've been presented with this other model. So I'm trying to get scientists to change that model.
And what about you, Regina? What are your advices?
For me, it's often thinking about the audience and realizing that I'm talking to actual people. And I think when I was taught how to write science back in graduate school, which means I was not really taught how to write science very well, the goal was to show everyone how smart I was and brilliant, and I knew everything, and it was all about me, 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 me. It wasn't about the audience. And writing is a form of communication, and communication is between at least two people in there. So thinking about an audience, I like to picture who is likely to be picking up my paper or my writing. Are they in medical school? Are they clinicians? Are they researchers? What do they know? Why are they reading this? Why should they continue reading this? They might have picked it up. All of that, I think, thinking about talking to a particular person helps reduce all of that stuff that Kristin is talking about, all that clutter and jargon and acronyms, because some of that gets down to I'm making it about me instead of the information that I'm trying to convey.
Great answers. Kristin, we know you write about sports, sport medicine. What motivated you to write exactly about sports, and which is your favorite sport, by the way?
Yeah. So the background there, the reason I've drifted, like I do a lot of data analysis in sports medicine and I write a lot about that area, is I am a former competitive runner. So I have a bias there. So I used to run. In fact, the story of how I ended up in epidemiology is kind of fun. So I did biology as an undergraduate, and I worked in a wet lab. Didn't enjoy it too much. Took a year off after college to run competitively, and hadn't figured out what I was doing next. But I knew there was a running team out at Stanford. So I wrote away, because this is in the old days, nothing online. You have to write away to get the catalog for grad school. So I get the catalog for grad school, and I'm looking at all the biology department, and I've missed the deadline for all of those. But there was one department at the bottom, one program, epidemiology, which had a January 15th deadline. I hadn't missed the deadline. So I said, "Oh, what's epidemiology?" And I read the description. And it was like, "Oh, great. It's studying diseases not in a wet lab." So I ended up at Stanford really because of the running team, more than it's happenstance that I happened upon epidemiology. So yes, running is my favorite. My daughter, though, is a very competitive swimmer, and so I've learned a lot about swimming lately too.
Oh, that's interesting. And what about you, Regina? Which topic is your favorite?
Ooh, good question. Oh, not sports, I will say.
Okay.
I did write once for ESPN magazine, which is a magazine all about sports, and I wrote about using nasal strips on racehorses. But I don't believe that actually counts as sports. I like writing about anything a little offbeat, maybe, or that's fun, that I can draw people in and then slip in some science and statistics along the way. I don't know. Kristin, what do you think? You know my writing. How would you describe?
I think that's exactly what you're doing in the podcast. And what's interesting is Regina and I are sort of switching off. And so the ones that she leads and picks the paper, they tend to be, we've got one coming out about hookworms, and we did pheromones. We're doing, they're really kind of cool topics, because you like to get, I think it engages students a lot too, to put out topics that are a little fun and either icky or just kind of,
outrageous.
Outrageous. Yeah. So you've always written in that genre. Yeah.
Should I go? So can you give us an overview? How do you start introducing people to epidemiology or statistics? Do you have a roadmap? So you start showing basic knowledge regarding statistics. Do you give small tasks and they need to perform that by themselves? Do you have a favorite software also for that, for the initial learning steps? What can you talk about it?
Well, I get students, I think, at the beginning of their entree into epidemiology, because most of my students are either master's students, often physicians, or they're in our online certificate program. And so they're coming in fresh and they often don't have much statistics background. So my main goal is to engage them by talking about real papers. So I talk and things in the news. So I will pick things like the election, or we'll talk about election data, or something that's topical, or papers that, it's actual scientific papers. And we'll do a lot of statistical sleuthing. That's kind of my thing, is to say, hey, let's actually go through this paper and look at the numbers, and want to get across that they can have no background in statistics, but they can still spot a lot of the errors that are in these papers. And it gives them a sense of confidence, I think. And also I think statistical sleuthing is also really just, it's like a little bit of a mystery detective story. So I think that that's how I try to engage students initially.
When I teach statistics, I try to use real data I enjoy having them get in and play around with real data that is often of interest to them. There's a great data set I have of online dating profiles. And so I just start out the class and say, okay, what questions might you have about this that we might be able to answer with the data? And then from that, we can derive methods for answering those questions, for analyzing the data, but it's driven by those questions and that curiosity rather than teaching a methodology. I have freedom to be a little bit more flexible with that. But rather than starting with the methodology, I start with the questions and then add the methodology just in time. And then I also really emphasize that they need to communicate the results and write about it or create pictures or something, and because you can analyze data in R. That's what I teach in R. You can analyze data and get results, and then that means nothing. You need to apply it, interpret it.
The course that we teach together, we do an online course on introduction to statistics called Demystifying Data on Stanford Online. And one of the things I think that's unique about that course is we get into it by asking questions. So a lot of introductory statistics course, you start with, let's do a normal curve and let's, you start kind of from the theory up, and we've turned it around and we say, let's start with what is the question? Like, where did the data come from, and kind of putting it, kind of backwards, so that you start with the interesting stuff rather than just like, hey, let's start with the theoretical stuff.
Right. Stories. It's about the stories in there. People love stories. These are good questions. I hadn't thought about how to get people interested in epidemiology and statistics if they just needed to get there on their own.
Yeah, which is really important for physicians. Yeah.
When I taught the biostats class for med students, with Julie Parsonette, I remember that there was a big auditorium and there was a light in the auditorium, like a little bulb or something, and it would turn on or flash. It meant you're invited to come to the morgue and watch an autopsy, or you're invited to come to the OR. And people would just start leaving in droves instead of listening to my beautifully crafted statistics lectures. And they're just leaving. And finally I had to ask, and they said, well, it's because we get to go cut up bodies or see dead bodies. And I said, yeah, I get it. I might leave too.
Well, I passed off. I got handed that class for like a year, and I passed that off quickly to Rita.
Oh, really?
I didn't want to do that class.
I thought it was a fun. It was a challenging class because it was, at that time, it was for first years, and it's just like he was saying, between listening to some dry statistics or epidemiology, or getting
it was hard to
go
for them to see why they would need that. Yeah.
That needed to be his second year.
So I have another point. Probably it's something that we can see in our reality with our medical students who are working with us in the department. I just want to ask you if you have the same situation. We can see an increasing interest in meta-analysis, because I think that's a really low-cost way to produce evidence, so to speak. And I think that's something that's definitely motivation for the students, because they can still in medical school, and sometimes they can have a paper as first author. We know that meta-analysis has their limitations, but I think that nowadays with new softwares that are free, it's definitely a new landscape for students. They can somehow be independent researchers. It could be dangerous to produce evidence in that way, but which are your thoughts?
Kristin and I have strong opinions about this. Yes.
You've hit one of our pet peeves. Yes. So unfortunately, meta-analysis, because it appears to be a free publication, like, oh, I don't have to get IRB approval. I don't have to collect data. I can stick into RevMan software. Both Regina and I think, yes, this is highly dangerous and absolutely should not be what we are recommending for med students. That meta-analysis is actually extremely complex to do it correctly, and the literature has been polluted by meta-analysis. So I have a student, a PhD, well, now former PhD student, he graduated, but one of the papers he wrote was he was looking at how many times are we just repeating the same meta-analysis And he found that a lot of, this was in genetics, the meta-analyses were just repeats. And it's because people have this perception, well, oh yeah, I'll just write a meta-analysis and I can get a publication out of it. And I also have a paper that I did recently in the sports science domain where we looked at meta-analyses in sports, specifically in strength and conditioning research. And that's a fun paper, actually, if you want to see all the things that can go wrong in meta-analysis. We looked at problems in those papers and found just a trove of, like, a lot of the effect sizes are just completely incorrect because they mix up standard deviation and standard error, like a really, really basic thing. So and Regina, you and I teach that meta-analysis on masking that was written by med students, which is atrocious and never got published, but it was online. So it's just a really bad idea to set a med student out to say, oh, go do a meta-analysis because it's a free publication. We have strong feelings about that. Regina, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah. I think in some ways we are guilty because we set up this research hierarchy pyramid that I alluded to earlier, saying, oh, case studies and then observational and then clinical trials. And at the top is the meta-analysis. And we forget to mention that bad meta-analyses are worse than no meta-analyses at all, that they need to be good and that they are very difficult to do well. And as Kristin mentioned, the proliferation of free and easy software, we are letting the software, the algorithms, to do the thinking for us instead of us doing the thinking. And meta-analysis is about thinking very carefully and putting information together and synthesizing it. And I would not trust software or algorithms to do that. And I think that part of the problem is peer review as well. Peer review it gives it a free pass because, oh, it's, they did it in a software and it's the top of the pyramid. And I think that we will start to see people cracking down on that, peer review cracking down, but not yet.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a good message because we also trust in that point because meta-analysis is something to be done with a team and not just an individual. That's the first point, and is exactly what you commented. So if you garbage in is garbage out. So if you select studies who had a bad design, in the end of the day, you are just pulling confounders and overexpressing bias. So it's probably you don't provide new evidence or something that could be solid. That's a good point. Thank you for adding that.
I feel like a 6-year-old kid here among. So imagine that I'm a 6-year-old kid and I'm asking Kristin, Regina, what's a p-value? How can you explain me that?
Okay, I might need to take that one. You're a 6-year-old kid. What is a p-value? I would probably illustrate it using my favorite cartoon online. Have you ever watched Red XKCD, the cartoon?
I think
fine.
no.
It's, okay, it's very nerdy. It's very nerdy, so I'll give you that. But let's say I'll illustrate it with Kristin. Kristin, I tell you that I'm psychic, and and Kristin says,
right. So I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 20. What's the number I'm thinking of? Right,
Kristin is a skeptic. She does not believe me, but I'm telling her, no, I really am psychic. Okay, 1 to 20. Oh, very nice. And I say, okay, the number is 17.
No, sorry.
Yeah. No, wait a minute. Okay, we're illustrating the p-value and the false positive. Okay.
Oh,
Kristin,
I'm supposed to say yes. Okay, let's say you got it on the first try. Yes.
Yes,
okay.
I got it on the first try. And then Kristin says, holy crap, I can't believe that you got that. It's even more impressive, of course, if it's, she tells me to think of something 1 to 100, and I get it right in the first try, or 1 to 1,000. She said, holy crap, that is amazing. And I say, yeah, I'm just, it's no big deal. But then as an aside, I tell you, the 6-year-old, this trick works only one time out of 100. If I'm asking you to choose a number 1 to 100, I only get it right one time out of 100. So I would have to repeat this over and over. But the one time that I get it right, and I impress the heck out of my friend, and she is amazed, and she has to go buy me a drink now because I am now the psychic. That's what a p-value is. It is expressing how surprised you should be at this result. So the p-value of that experiment, if we said 1 to 100, the p-value of that experiment is 0.01, which is super impressive, right? It's very surprising. If we did 1 to 20 and I got it right, okay, still impressive. A p-value of 5% because it's 1 out of 20. I have one chance out of 20 of getting it right just by guessing. If it's 1 out of 2, very much not impressive. And that's a p-value of 0.5. It's not surprising. So I say a p-value is really just an index of surprise. It's telling you how surprised you should be if you get an exciting result and nothing more than just chance was at work there.
Oh, that's awesome. I think that's a brilliant explanation. Probably have a question to Kristin in that same perspective. Probably you can also summarize in really simple words for our audience. Can you define these typical measures of association like odds ratio, standard mean difference, and hazard ratio? And I think that definitely is a point that people mix a lot. They combine time to event data with odds ratio, things like that. Can you give just a simple and brief introduction in this topic?
Sure. So I think you're talking about relative risks, right? Where we take risks in different groups and we make various measures with them. And there's a lot of ways that we measure risk. And so just to kind of go through them, we can start with risk being prevalence, which is just how many people have a disease in two populations. And I want to compare that. And we divide, the prevalence in one group by the prevalence in the other group. That's called a prevalence ratio. And how do you interpret that? Well, it's just like one group has, if you've got a value of 2 on that, you have double the prevalence in one group versus another. Kind of similar to that is a risk ratio, which is, hey, I actually followed people over time. And I said, I started with 100 people and 20 of them, none of them had the disease and 20 of them got the disease. And that's 20% probability in that time frame of getting the disease. Now, it's totally dependent on the time frame, right? If the study's 1 year versus 10 years, I'm going to get different numbers. But I can do that. I can take 2 groups that I want to compare, somebody who's like smokers and non-smokers. I can follow them over time, and we can get what's called the cumulative risk, which is how many people develop the disease in that time period, what percentage. And then I can divide those 2 numbers, and that's called the risk ratio. And you would interpret, if it's a value of 2, you've doubled the risk of developing the disease in that time frame. Now, odds ratios are a really weird measure, and it's hard to even explain why they exist. But instead of, you could take that same data, and you could say, instead of saying it's a 20% risk, I could translate that to an odds like you would in gambling. So 20% versus 80%. It's an odds is your chance of something happening divided by the chance of it not happening. So if it was a 20% risk, it's a 20 divided by 80 or 1 to 4 odds. And you can take those odds in the smokers, and you can take the odds of the non-smokers, and you can divide those, and that gives you an odds ratio, which has a very bizarre, it's hard to interpret. If it's 2, it's the doubling of your odds of something happening. But the doubling of odds is not the same as the doubling of the likelihood or chance or probability. And often people mix that up. The fact is, in a lot of cases when odds ratios are presented, they don't need to use an odds ratio. And the reason there's an odds ratio in that paper is because they used a technique called logistic regression, which is the regression technique for binary outcomes. And it happens to spit out odds ratios. So people just take those and dump them in their paper. So good thing to know about logistic regression, if you have a data set that is not a case control study, you've actually followed people over time and you're measuring risk, and you use logistic regression, you don't have to report odds ratios. You can take the values from that logistic regression and actually you can figure out adjusted risks for the groups, and you can actually report risk ratios. People don't know that. So odds ratios are this weird measure that we often get very confused. If the outcome is common, those odds ratios can be very misleading. And I've got lots of funny stories where, something like there was a study where the difference between the groups was like 86% and 85%. and yet the odds ratio was like 0.4. And so it looked like there was some big difference, but the difference was 1%. So you can exaggerate differences. And then the final one, the hazard ratio, that's the best measure. That's the one we want, because that's when we take hazard ratios or related to that rate ratios. We follow people over time and we track the time period and we incorporate time. It's called an incidence rate in how quickly people are developing a disease in both groups. And then we divide that, or we use a model that gives us what's called the hazard ratio, which is looking at the, how quickly the difference in speed that people are developing a disease or a condition. And so that's the hazard ratio. And that is actually what we'd always love to have, but that requires that you actually measure dates on people and very carefully track the timing of events. And we don't always have that.
Really good answer. So let's switch slightly into that topic, normal curves. What motivated you to create that really great podcast?
Oh, good question. Like many brilliant ideas, I don't know if we can pin it to one particular moment. Kristin and I started collaborating. You didn't ask how we met. We're actually friends in grad school. 25 years ago, grad school, we were friends. Yes. And we've kept in touch ever since then, and we've had these similar careers. And I would say maybe about 5-6 years ago, we started really collaborating a lot on teaching projects and writing projects. And one of the classes that we teach at Stanford, we use video lectures where we would have conversations, where we would talk through case studies. And our students loved it. And they said, "Do you have a podcast? We would listen to your podcast on our spare time, in our spare time. We love this so much." And we thought they were kidding, but then the next cohort said the same thing, and the cohort after that. And we thought, okay, maybe we should do this then. That would be one start, right?
Yeah, that was, I think, the nugget of the idea was we started doing these, what we called podcast videos, podcast lecture style, or podcast style lectures, and using those for our students. And one of them said, "Hey, I'm watching this instead of Netflix on Fridays," which we were like, "Oh, that warms our heart." So that they kind of gave us the idea that maybe these kinds of conversations and telling stories around statistical topics and papers, that people might be interested in this. And then I think Regina and I both have written a lot for lay audiences in the past, where I wrote a health column for many, many years, and I had, about this much space to talk about 3 different papers, and we didn't get a lot of room to sort of dive deep. And actually what I used to do when I wrote that column is, if there was a paper that actually had bad statistics and I felt like I couldn't write about it for a lay audience, I was also writing a statistics column, so I would throw it over to the other pile and talk about the bad statistics. But we felt like there was a lot of topics we covered, and you didn't have enough space to kind of go deep. We would have conversations about these topics in the papers, and we thought, it's fun and we could educate people on statistics by talking about these kind of topics that we've covered before, but in a lot more depth, and really getting down deep into the papers and the methods, and in a way that you can't quite do for a magazine article.
Yeah, a little bit of a behind the scenes, or behind the headlines. What's really going on in there? And the key is that we pick really fun topics that you've read about in the media. Yeah,
and we trick people into learning a little statistics along the way.
And where can our audience find you? You are on YouTube, right?
Mm-hmm. And Apple Podcast and Spotify, all the major podcast distributors. Yes.
Yeah, we have a website, normalcurves.com. So if you go to normalcurves.com, it has a link to all of our online courses that we've talked about, and also all the places where you can get the podcast, and as well as the episode description. And we have some of them have very extensive show notes. So if you want a lot of details, you can go to the website.
So all of our viewers, please subscribe to Normal Curves.
Yes, please.
And go and visit. One last question. As I told you, I'm doing my first steps, and sometimes I feel frustrated or in burnout. What are your tips for me to keep pushing in statistics? That's my last question.
Well, I'm going to just reiterate that if you're reading a lot of statistics books or scientific papers and you are feeling frustrated, just keep in mind that is on the author. That is not on you or your ability or your knowledge. And unfortunately, a lot of science and a lot of the way statistics is taught and presented is in this very, hey, I'm going to show you how smart I am, as Regina talked about earlier. And it's not written in a way, it is written in a way that would make you frustrated. So you're not alone in feeling frustrated. And Regina and I are trying to change the way things are taught and the way people write and communicate. And so, so try, just understand you're not alone.
You're not alone. And I think related to that, not everyone likes learning with a community, but it does help you get through those moments where you're frustrated. And if you are learning data analysis, especially through R, the open source statistical software, R for data science, they have a learning community and they get together on Slack. It's huge and they support each other. There's something called Tidy Tuesday where they post a new data set every Tuesday and everyone's encouraged to create data visualizations and post their code online. There's they have book clubs where they'll be reading through a book by Hadley Wickham and they get together, Zoom meetings and discuss it, every month, every week, something. So I think tapping into other people who are in the same position as you, very very educated, very smart, but just don't have a lot of this formal background in this area, getting together and supporting each other. I think that could be a great way to get involved.
Okay. So, Kristin, Regina, I'm really grateful for your time. It was a pure pleasure for both of us to have you on our podcast. And as I told you, I leave the door open for second episode.
Thank you very much.
We would love
really
that.
appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. We'd be happy to come back. This has been a lot of fun.
This has been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you very
care.
much.
Take care.